Well, some of your listeners will recall that there was a very serious war in Yemen that went on for several years. It finally reached a kind of conclusion between Saudi Arabia and the Yemeni tribesmen we refer to as the Houthis, are overwhelmingly Shia or Shiite tribesmen. And they essentially fought each other to a standstill over a number of different issues. That ended, as I said, largely in 2016, and we had a hand in helping to end it. You'll recall there was a terrible famine. Hundreds of thousands of people suffered. Tens of thousands died. So we widely opposed it and finally discovered, this has got to stop, and we prevailed upon the Saudis to negotiate. Now, what's happening today is that Yemen has advanced quite a bit, and the only people that would help the Houthis at the time were the Iranians, who were also Shiite. Mm-hmm. So the Houthis are Shiite Arabs, and initially they sought help from other quarters. They actually tried to negotiate with the Saudis. They couldn't do it. The Saudis were cooperating with al-Qaeda to kill as many Houthis as possible. And that's when they went back to Iran and said, you've got to help us, which they ultimately did, armed them and helped them drive off the Saudis and kill as many of the al-Qaeda fighters that were in their country as they could. Today, the Houthis, being Arabs, have declared war for all intents and purposes on Israel. And you have to understand that all of the militias that we refer to all the time as Iranian proxies or Iranian-backed that are in Iraq or Syria or Yemen or southern Lebanon, they're all Arabs. And as Arabs, they can all agree universally that what the Israelis are doing in Gaza is to simply an operation of mass murder and expulsion to either kill or push all the people that live in Gaza out of Gaza. So they decided to declare war, and they accurately concluded that the easiest thing they could do was to disrupt shipping that moves from the Indian Ocean up through the Red Sea and ultimately the Suez Canal. Much of it does go to Europe, but some of it turns to the west and goes into Israel, either through the Gulf of Aqaba or in the Eastern Mediterranean. They've been very successful with relatively old technology. They're not using the best and the newest technology the Iranians have because the Iranians haven't given it to them. But they've given them some very good missiles. They're subsonic, which means they're easier to target and shoot down, and lots of drones. And they've been remarkably successful. We decided to attack them because we thought that by doing so we would stop this. And the sad outcome is that we've turned the region into a war zone, effectively. Said it publicly, it is now a war zone. So you have no one who is willing to ensure any commercial ships to move through the Red Sea. So in doing what we've done, we've actually defeated our purpose, which was to try and open the Red Sea to commercial traffic. Now no one will go there.
Talk about counterintuitive. My goodness. So needless to say, it sounds like the answer to my question of, is this a wise thing for the United States to do at this point? Your answer is no.
Well, I think the first thing we should have done, which is the last thing we do, if we do it at all, is that we should have talked to the Houthis. Now, I'm told that we have back-channeled a message to Iran, which we are currently threatening with a war, to somehow or another prevail upon the Houthis not to do what they're doing. But the truth is that the Houthis are Arabs, and while they appreciate Iran's support, they are firmly committed to this war with Israel. Mm-hmm. So they are not going to stop. But what we could have done is talk to them and try to reason with them. And, of course, they would have said, well, if you want us to stop, you Americans need to stop the Israelis from murdering tens of thousands of people and driving them out of their homes and making Gaza unlivable. We have refused to do that. So I'm not sure what else we could have done, but I don't think we explored it at all, with the result that I think the Houthis will once again attack commercial ships if they see any. They'll probably try to attack our ships, our warships. They've already tried a couple of times without much success because, as I said, this is not the newest up-to-date technology. These are not missiles designed to sink ships by any stretch of the imagination. So we've made it a war zone. Nobody will go into the Red Sea. It's actually worse than it was before we started. And I hear people in Washington now talk about the use of ground forces to go into the mountains of Yemen and dig these people out and shoot them. And what I tell people is that, our British allies spent some time down in Yemen and fought many of these tribesmen, and that was a pretty unrewarding experience. And after fighting for several years, they packed up and simply left. It's a terrible place to fight a war. And these people have lived there for a long time. They are very tough. They've taken heavy losses in the past. And I don't see much evidence that we did much damage with our strikes. We seem to have hit a lot of the same targets that the Saudis and we back before 2016 struck. And those areas were fairly easy to target and find. But whether or not they actually harmed the larger military capability of the Houthis is very much open to debate. Now, the worst thing the Houthis can do is, if we keep this up, is that they could begin destroying oil infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And once you begin destroying oil fields, things get very dicey. I mean, the Turks just, within the last 24 hours, launched an airstrike against oil infrastructure in eastern Syria, which is currently under control of Kurds and others that have been harassing Turkey. I don't know what's going to happen as a result of that, but it's a bad idea. And all of the oil infrastructure in the Persian Gulf is very fragile and very vulnerable.
If people are just tuning in, we're talking with Colonel Douglas McGregor, former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. So, Colonel, given what you said we should have done, which was talk to the Houthis and tried to get them to stop the attacks on vessels in the Red Sea, what should we do now? If you were advising the current Secretary of Defense or the current president, what would you be telling them about what the United States should do prospectively as it relates to this Yemen situation?
Well, this is a tough question, because we've already shot ourselves in the foot by turning the Red Sea into a war zone, and the insurance companies that keep the commercial vessels moving won't insure anybody going into it. I don't know how you reverse that, because as long as there's a Houthi that can launch a drone or a missile of any kind, I suspect that Lloyd's of London and others will all say no thank you, and you have to drive around the Cape of Good Hope down in South Africa and all the way up into the Mediterranean through the Strait of Gibraltar or further north. So I don't think there's an easy answer. To do nothing at this point would seem to be a bad idea, but it's actually a good idea insofar as not sending ground troops into the Arabian Peninsula. Mm-hmm. Our Saudi allies, or partners, whatever you want to call them, actually told us not to attack the Houthis, and they said they would not join us in any attack on the Houthis. And there is no love lost between the Sunni Arabs in Saudi Arabia and the Shiite Arabs in Yemen. They obviously have been at war. They don't like each other, but they would have nothing to do with it, once again, because all of the Arabs are opposed to what the Israelis are doing, and they're trying to persuade us to intercede and put an end to the operation. So unless we're willing to turn to the Israelis and say, halt your operations in Gaza, and I don't see any evidence that we will do that, I'm not sure there's a great deal that we can do. Mm-hmm. For the moment, the commercial traffic is going to be rerouted, however inconvenient and expensive that may be.
I referenced the objections of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Ro Khanna that this is being done without congressional approval. Is that a concern that you share? Have we seen too much of, for lack of a better description, an imperial presidency that doesn't go to Congress when it comes to military adventurism?
Frank, I think we've had an imperial presidency since FDR was in office. And I generally tell people, they don't like to hear it, we live in a post-constitutional government or post-constitutional America. Congress rubber stamps certain things because of donors that want those things to happen. And at the moment, there is a unanimity of interest between the people sitting in the White House and the people on the Hill. They tend to agree that they want war in the Middle East. We are going to back the Israelis unconditionally, and if necessary, we're ready to go to war with Iran. So I don't see any evidence that you're going to get the kind of constitutional breaks on action that we would have seen, say, 100 years ago.
Well, that's certainly unfortunate, and but unfortunately, probably pretty realistic. One of the things that we've heard over the weekend is threats of Houthi reprisal, essentially warning the United States and the UK that there's going to be hell to pay for their decision to engage with the Houthis militarily. Is that a concern that you think Americans should be worried about?
Well, if it's a concern, particularly if it interferes or disrupts supply chains as well as commercial traffic, it's a serious concern if they attack oil infrastructure. I mean, what's there to stop them from attacking oil infrastructure in the Persian Gulf? Now, I don't think they want to do that because those are fellow Arabs. But on the other hand, they may see that as a useful way to demonstrate just how potentially powerful they can be. And again, they did damage some of the oil infrastructure in many of the oil fields, and refineries and so forth were protected by Patriot missile systems, and the Patriot missile systems did not down any of the long-range drones that struck those areas in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. So I think they can do some real damage. I suspect that's a real possibility. Look at what are the vulnerabilities. One of the problems that we Americans have is that we never examine our vulnerabilities. We tend to think of ourselves as overwhelmingly powerful, as the sort of invincible and vulnerable superpower. Well, we're not. And the simple disruption in oil infrastructure and the consequential disruption of supply chains across the Indian Ocean, between Africa, the Middle East, China, Japan, Korea, are very serious, extremely serious. And, they could send the world into an economic spiral without a great deal of difficulty. Now, I don't know what that means. I don't know what they'll do. But we don't ask those questions. Before you do something, you must always ask the question, we have to measure whatever we think we're going to gain by what we might lose. So while bombing somebody may be very satisfying inside of Washington and make the men and women on the Hill feel powerful and influential, it may actually be a very dumb idea. And I think this will turn out to have been a very dumb idea. But given where I think we're headed right now, we're going into a regional war. It's going to take another 3 months for this to coalesce, but I think we're going to see a major regional explosion in April and May. It's going to be far more than we ever anticipated because the entire region is enraged by this in Gaza and our complicity in it.
So now you essentially have a situation where the United States is very involved in 3 different wars, right? You have the Ukraine situation, which, if time permits, I'll ask you about. You have the situation with Israel and Gaza, which now seems to have expanded to Lebanon as well. And you have the situation in Yemen. How much more escalation do you expect to see? I mean, we've already seen, some members of the president's own party, including Bernie Sanders, who I suspect you don't generally agree with, but he was on television yesterday on CNN saying,
Jake, if I use the word Dresden, Germany to you, you think about the horrific destruction during World War II of that city. What is going on in Gaza now in 3 months is worse than what took place in Dresden over a 2-year period. This is a catastrophe.
He actually said this is a catastrophe. I'm curious where we go from here. You've said it's likely to get worse. What does that look like?
Well, in terms of bomb tonnage, Senator Sanders is correct. With the exception of the attack on Hamburg, which firebombed that city, killed 40,000 people in a very short period of time. All the other attacks in Germany, including what you just mentioned, Dresden and so forth, were much less violent and less destructive than what the Israelis had done in Gaza. So Senator Sanders is right. And by the way, I don't agree with his views on domestic politics, but he and I are much closer on foreign policy. Now, if you've got to go back to Israel because all of this begins and ends in Israel. the Israeli government decided to go into Gaza. And ostensibly it was for the purpose of punishing the Gazan population to some extent, but really to destroy Hamas and rescue hostages. Well, it became pretty clear that this was going to take a lot longer than they anticipated, and I think they subsequently reverted to the old plan that dates back decades to complete clearing Arabs out of Israel. And Gaza seemed like a great place to start. And the attack on 7 October, even though now we've had a lot of information that suggests that not all of the alleged atrocities were committed on 7 October, was nevertheless an horrific attack. And this was used as an emotional issue to drag Israel and its population into a full-fledged war. And let there be no mistake about it, 85+% of the Israeli population is soundly behind this war to destroy Gaza and its population. They absolutely believe in it, and they're committed to it. However, after 100 days, it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked for a lot of reasons. Hamas has turned out to be a much tougher opponent than anticipated. It's very, very difficult to go into these built-up areas, particularly after you've destroyed them and made the area much easier for the defender than it is for the attacker. And we learned that during the Second World War. If you were going to go take a city, the biggest mistake you could make would be to destroy it. You wanted it largely intact because it makes it far easier for you to go into the city and deal directly with the defenders. Now the Israelis can't do that. They find tunnels and they find tunnels and they find lots of empty tunnels, and they don't necessarily find all of the Hamas fighters that they've been looking for. They've made claims that they've killed 8,000 Hamas fighters, but we see no corpses to indicate that. What we do see are a lot of dead civilians. So I think at this point the Israelis have taken a short pause on the ground. They've pulled out some of their battalions and brigades, which were chewed up and exhausted, and they're probably going to be refitted. But each night the bombing continues, and I expect that will continue into the indefinite future because Mr. Netanyahu has said this war will go on for months, potentially years, notwithstanding whether or not Israel can actually withstand that kind of economic damage. So now he's talking about turning north and redirecting the ground force towards the border with Hezbollah. In other words, his answer to failure to achieve his aims in Gaza is to escalate elsewhere. And he's going to escalate, I think, in Lebanon against Hezbollah. Now, what's the benefit to Israel of escalating against Hezbollah? Well, the benefit is that it will probably drag us into the war, because the reason we had that carrier battle group that has not yet been replaced, as I understand it, but probably will be shortly, was to supplement and augment Israeli air power in a war against Hezbollah. Now, once we are involved in the war against Hezbollah from the air, I don't think it's going to be very long before we find reasons to go after Iran. We've already blamed everything that is happening to us in Iraq and Syria on Iran, when in reality Iran doesn't really need to encourage anybody to attack us in Iraq and Syria. Everybody wants us out. They wanted us out for a long time. Now that we're backing unconditionally whatever the Israelis want to do in Gaza, they want to kill us. The smart thing would have been to get out. President Trump wanted to get us completely out of Syria and Iraq in October, November of 2020. But his opportunity to make those things happen passed, and that opportunity was lost. So then you're up against Iran. In the meantime, you have problems in Egypt. Mr. Netanyahu has said that he's going to send the Israeli Defense Force into the so-called Philadelphia Corridor. This is the territory that lies between Gaza and Egypt. In other words, that southern border, because it's a sieve. Too much gets in, too much comes out. And he says it's got to stop, and the only way to do that is to go in there with the Israeli Defense Force. Well, that could very easily lead to a war with Egypt, because that's a direct assault on Egyptian sovereignty. And people who point out that the Egyptians and the Israelis cooperated against ISIS and ISIS-related Islamists in Sinai fail to understand that Hamas is not viewed in the same way that ISIS was. Hamas is viewed as a resistance organization against Israeli occupation.
Mm-hmm.
The Egyptian population is celebrating Hamas. The Egyptian population was happy to support the destruction of ISIS. So General Sisi, who runs Egypt, is going to have to make some hard decisions. Is he going to sit there and let the Israelis walk all over the Egyptians and do what they want, which is, of course, what we would like? Or is he going to say, no, if you do that, we will have to confront you militarily? I don't know. I think Sisi's in a tough position. So is King Abdullah in Jordan. He has millions of Palestinians in his own country. They are all ready to arm and cross the Jordan River and go into the West Bank to support the Palestinians there, who are under pretty severe pressure and periodic nightly raids and attacks by the Israeli Defense Force. Thousands of them have been placed under arrest, and numbers of them have been killed. So you've got a problem in Jordan, you've got a problem in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates. Now, they're not interested in a war, that is, the leadership isn't, but their populations are enraged. Iraq's population is enraged. Its Arab population, the Kurds, of course, are completely divorced from all of it, but the Arabs are enraged. And it's going to be very difficult to contain that rage, and the governments are going to feel compelled to do something, because if they do not act decisively and lead their countrymen against Israel, well, they're probably going to be removed from power.
Colonel, I know you've already been very generous with your time. I know it's late. I'm going to let you get some rest. I have two final questions for you, which I think will be brief. I know you've done a lot of advising of the Israeli military over the years. The chief of the Israeli Defense Force General Staff made your book required reading for high-ranking officers. It's been publicly reported that you traveled to Israel to meet with the IDF General Staff and some of their senior officers to discuss ways to transform it into the 21st century fighting force. Has this whole situation, the war, America's support of the war, the recent strikes in Yemen, has this, since October 7th situation, made Israel safer and more secure, and has it made the United States safer and more secure?
No, it hasn't. The Israeli senior military leaders, in fact, a professional component of the Israeli Defense Force, which is overwhelmingly citizen soldiers, as you know, but the professional military component is of very high quality. These are very bright people, very smart people. I don't know what was discussed in private, but I'm quite certain that the Israeli military leaders made clear, the problems associated with going into Gaza the way they have. But they probably weren't listened to. I know that they understand what it means to take on Hezbollah, and no doubt they have made those views clear as well. The Israeli Defense Force is hard pressed if it has to deal with both of those things simultaneously, as well as an unstable West Bank. But the bottom line is that we and the Israelis are very isolated in the world right now. This vote in the UN and our absolute refusal to acknowledge what's happening in Gaza has put us in a very difficult position, particularly with the global South and with Russia, China, India, Brazil, all the major powers, the people we associate with BRICS. Now, some people may sit there and say, well, who cares? What difference does it make? Well, the world has changed, Frank. The people that live in the Middle East, in Central Asia, in Southwest Asia and Eastern Europe, these are not backward peasants. These are not people without understanding. They are not all fools. 50 years ago, large numbers of Arabs couldn't even read and write. Well, the literacy levels have risen dramatically. They all have cell phones. They understand the internet, and many of them are very savvy technologically. It is a mistake to dismiss them. It's a mistake to treat them badly, to ignore their interests, and I think we're going to pay a terrible price for it. And as I said before, I think events are pointing towards this war with Iran, and that will not be the end. Russia will not allow Iran to be destroyed, and eventually you will see the Turks come into this, and the Turks are a regional superpower. And the real question in everybody's mind is what happens with Israel's nuclear weapons. And they're preparing for that. Iran is certainly preparing for it. And the Turks can easily acquire nuclear warheads from Pakistan if they think they need them to deter the Israelis. So this is a very dangerous path we're on right now.
Yeah.
And I don't see any off-ramps. I see no one in Washington thinking any of it through. And my concern about Israel is a little different from everybody else's. I'm worried that this could be the end of Israel. That's how serious this situation is. Remember, Israel's not a very large country. And you can destroy a country without necessarily marching over it in great numbers. You have missiles, conventional and otherwise, that can do enormous damage. And that's something I don't want to see happen to Israel. I've always felt we had an obligation to help Israel out of this mess, not double down on it and make it easy for them to essentially drag us in and create suicide in the regional war that I think is coming.
We've been talking with Colonel Douglas McGregor, author, former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. At one point was President Trump's selection to become ambassador to Germany. Didn't ultimately come to fruition. Final question, sir, not related to this directly, but there was a lot of criticism of the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and the Biden administration more broadly for how they handled the hospitalization of Secretary Austin and the lack of knowledge that apparently everybody, including the president, had about this hospitalization. There are even some Republican members of Congress that have called on General Austin to resign. Give me your view on this. How big of a deal was this?
It's very serious. You were living on the edge of war. In other words, we may not have a declared war in front of us, but we live on the edge of war. We've already failed miserably in Ukraine. Ukraine is in ruins. It's destroyed. Russia will ultimately decide the fate of Ukraine. We'll have nothing to do with it. We keep trying to provoke them. It won't work. The Russians are too smart for that. And we are not prepared for a regional war. I don't know Lloyd Austin personally. I don't dislike him personally. I'm not sure he's the right man for the job, but I do know that he has raised his voice from time to time and warned people about the fact that bombing the Yemenis, backing this operation in Gaza, these things are leading us down a dangerous road. I know he said that. And so I wish him well. I hope he recovers. And I'm not sure what's wrong with him. But the Secretary of Defense is too close in the chain of command to the Commander-in-Chief to be missing in action. There's something radically wrong inside this administration. I think it's very amateurish. It's not well organized. Decision-making is poor. So I'm really worried. I begin to have fourth-turning nightmares on a routine basis when I look at this group of people.
Well, on that optimistic and uplifting note, Colonel, it is always a treat to talk with you. I appreciate the insight. I get an education whenever we speak. Thank you.
All right, Frank.
Colonel
Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you. I will accept that Happy New Year, even though it's a little late than the official guidelines allow.